I don't know why I'm writing this, but I feel like I just have to. No one believes me anyway, so maybe putting my story down on paper will help me in some fashion. Fuck. I don't even know where I should begin. I guess I'll give some context. My family has owned a lake house for generations, and I'm talking about for at least 100 years of my family's history can be tied back to this place. The weird part to me, however, is that this was the only house on the lake, but the fact that we never used it was even weirder to me growing up. This fact changed in 2008 during the Great Recession. Times were rough. Both my parents were laid off, leaving us struggling in all financial aspects. So much so that my family had no other choice but to bounce house from the house until finally my dad made the decision to move into the old lake house. This was the first time my older brother and I have even heard of the lake house in our lives. Confused and upset that we would be moving once again, we asked why this is the first time we've ever heard of this house. This question was dodged each and every time we asked. Eventually, we just gave up. Our time there wasn't long, nor was it all that memorable. The only things I did remember from that place was the constant nagging from our parents to stay out of the woods. And every now and then, late at night, I would hear these annoying sirens blasting through the woods. The weirdest part about these sirens is that it was never the same sound. The howling would change each and every time with no real explanation. I remember asking my family about it, and the only real answer I got was that there was a military base nearby, and it was probably just coming from that. Being only 11, I just took that at its face value and let it be. Other than that, there was nothing of note in that short year span we spent in that location. My dad was luckily able to find a new job, and we moved out almost immediately as he got hired. Fast forward 11 years, I just graduated college and was feeling good. I wanted to celebrate, maybe take a trip, but knowing how broke my buddies and I were, I knew that was a no-go. So after a quick group meeting, we decided that the old lake house should be the location for our last college weekend bender. It did take a lot, and I mean a lot of convincing to get my parents to agree, but they let my older brother use the lake house when he graduated, so I was able to twist their arm with that. I was pumped. This was our last hurrah together, and we were planning on making the most of it. Granted, the almost daily reminders from my parents to stay out of the woods was a little bit of a buzzkill, but we had no plans at the time to even go into the woods. We had all the booze we needed to make sure that all 5 of us had no reason to leave the house or private beach. The plan was simple. Get fucked. Which went off without a hitch on the first night, well into the next morning. We were well into our second night of the binge. We'd started a fire out in the back and were happily reminiscing about our early years in college. This was interrupted, however, by the blaring sounds of a siren that were coming from deep within the forest nearby. I tried to explain that it was just a military base nearby, but after a quick search online, my buddies showed me there was no such base. Confused and curious about this siren, I was easily convinced to go with them to check it out. I did tell them that my parents were insistent upon us not going in the woods, but this only slowed us down for a bit. We convinced each other that they were just worried about wild animals. We all grabbed something to defend ourselves in case an animal did decide to attack. I managed to find my dad's rifle he kept in the house. I wasn't even sure if this thing would even fire. It hadn't been taken care of or cleaned in over a decade. We then set out with our makeshift arsenal and our phones, which we used for our flashlights. We walked for what seemed to be forever, following the sound of the siren that at times felt as if it was moving away from us. Blindly we followed it until about an hour in, while annoyed and tired, decided to give up. But almost as soon as we turned around, the siren stopped. All that was left was the eerie, oh so eerie silence. I mean, there was nothing. No crickets, no normal wildlife sounds at all. Only the sounds of our breaths and our footsteps filled our ears. The silence got to us, causing us to just ramble on about pointless subjects on our way back. Randomly, almost as if a switch flipped on, the sounds of wildlife filled the area. However, something seemed off. It seemed to be too loud, as if they were amplified, and they all seemed to be coming from the same direction as the siren was originating. All of us were more than just uneasy and felt the need to run. A couple of guys tried to make a joke and laugh at the uneasiness, but the air still seemed to be heavy around us. We must have been jogging for about 5 minutes before a deafening, no, a crippling siren started to blast. But this time, the sound was coming from in front of us. We stopped dead in our tracks. I remember the next part clearly, as if I was still in the moment. My buddies were all shouting. At least, I can only assume that was the case based on their motions and the way their mouths were moving, but I heard nothing but the siren. One of my buddies was on one knee, hands covering his ears. I moved to help him back up so that we could continue on our way back to the house. But as I took a step closer, a giant, metallic, fleshy claws that seemed to come from the treetops plucked him up like he was nothing. Frozen in disbelief, it took all my courage to look up. Oh God, how I wish I didn't look up. My eyes were met with a demonic-like creature that stood about 40 feet in the air. Its body looked as if it was a mesh of wood, flesh, and metal that was molded together by the devil himself. Its head, if you could call it that, consisted of 2 sirens that looked beaten down and worn out. The worst part of it all was what was inside of the sirens themselves. Sharp, pointed yellow teeth, frozen in a terrifying smile. I was frozen, helpless, as I watched my friend being lifted into this creature's mouth. The teeth slowly began to pry open as a long, girthy tongue slowly wrapped around his body. The tongue then began to retract, pulling him closer and closer. For a brief moment, the siren had stopped, allowing us to hear his screams and his cries for help. It was as if this creature wanted us to hear them. I was also able to hear one of my friends scream for me to shoot the beast as he ran up to what I believe was the leg of it. I came to my senses, and I aimed the gun at the beast and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit it, making a sound that I can't even describe to this day. A spurt of blood seemed to pop out of the monster, but it remained unfazed as it swallowed my friend whole. Then I heard a long, metallic clang. The sound came from an axe being struck against this thing's leg. My buddy, who had struck the creature, had his arms fling back, with almost no damage seen on the leg. The beast moved its foot, flinging my friend across the forest, smacking a tree. His back gave in, and his body contorted around the tree like a slap wrap on a forearm. The silence was soon destroyed, not by a siren this time, but by the sounds of screams. The screams were a jumbled mess of both men and women. I panicked. I dropped my gun and ran. I didn't look back. I just bolted. I don't know if my buddies followed me, and at the time, I did not care. I just wanted to get out alive. I ran and ran, but the sounds of the screams followed me relentlessly. I even began to think, just imagining them, peered over my shoulder to reassure myself that I wasn't being followed. But there it was, towering over the trees, weaving its way towards me. The fear boosted me to cause me to run even faster than I was before. I looked forward and saw the silhouettes of a few buildings just a little far off. Buildings that resembled that of a military base. I had my chance. This was it. If I could make it to the base, I was sure they would be able to stop this creature, whatever it was. As I got closer, the screams began to fade. Just by a bit, though. I did not care to look back, though. With a sigh of relief, I burst through the front entrance of the base. I could barely breathe. I felt as if I was about to pass out due to exhaustion. The scream stopped in that moment, and I couldn't help but look back. That is when all the dread that had left my body came pouring back in. When I turned around, it's not the beast that filled me with dread, but the camp itself. Huge claw marks were seen on almost all the buildings, stained blood on the walls. Whatever this thing was, it took on this base, and it fucking won. I fell to my knees. I was expecting to cry, but I couldn't. I was too drained to do anything. Static began to ring throughout the forest, with only the words, "Run, blood, hide, kill, food," cutting through the deafening static. At first, these sounds sounded far off, but within a few minutes, they were closer and closer. I used the last bit of my strength to pull myself off the ground and into a nearby building. Inside the building, I found nothing but cots, or the men stationed here must have slept. All I had the strength for was to crawl underneath one and pray that it'll leave. The static was moving closer and closer. It felt as if I was about to pass out. Then it stopped. Silence was back. I didn't know whether to be happy or terrified that the sound had stopped. What I heard next made me wish that the static had continued. I heard my friend's voice. It said, "Help me! Please help me! I'm hurt!" But I knew it wasn't him, because I watched him get swallowed by the beast. I turned to look at the door that had just a big enough window which allowed me to look outside. I saw the leg of the beast towering over the building. I froze. I made sure not to even breathe out of the fear it would hear me. Then came another cry for help, but this time from a friend I had left behind in my panic. That is when the tears began to flow. I couldn't control them anymore. I covered my mouth in hopes that I wouldn't be heard and stared outside the window. It was hard to see through the tears that were flowing out. But soon after the beast was done playing each of my friends' cries for help, it began to move. This time, it blasted the siren that we first heard, leaving me there bawling. The sounds began to fade, and so did my consciousness. Next thing I knew, I woke up with the sun beating through the window. I heard the sounds of birds chirping from all around me this time. I struggled to my feet and walked outside. With the creature nowhere in sight, I headed back to the cabin. Once I got back, I went inside, grabbed my keys, and took off. I waited till a few towns over to contact the police about what happened. I tried to explain what had happened to the police, but no one ever believed me. The facts they knew were that my 4 buddies were last seen with me, and they are now all missing, with no traces of them to be found. The judge decided to lock me up in an asylum when everything was said and done. I at first pleaded and begged my case. I attempted to appeal multiple times, but I never changed my story, so the verdict stood. All my father would say when I would ask for his help was that he told me to stay out of the forest and that he never should have let us go. But not all is lost. I've become accustomed to my life here, and it gives me a little sense of security at times, even though I know nothing can stop this creature. Although at times I do hear a siren off in the distance. But I have a feeling that at least for now, I'm not the target of its hunt.